Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. Our current session is about intersecting communities. I hope and expect by the end of this session you would be able to understand how do communities intersect, overlap, or become a part of each other and separate from each other. Well, my dear students, in order to do this, first what we need to think about is that people talk about certain languages in certain ways. For example, people use expressions such as New York speech, South African speech, Pakistani English, etc. So, people typically associate certain characteristics to a language, and what they think of is that there is a speech community from where everybody speaks in a typical way. A person has the typical style or characteristics of speaking according to that particular speech community. Another idea that we need to consider is of urbanization. The boundaries amongst nations and states are blurring very rapidly. The linguistic boundaries are blurring, and the speed with which all this is happening, it is leading towards what we call bilingualism and multilingualism. Consequently, what we find is that people are either bilingual or bidialectical. So, this unprecedented process of change in language where people are exposed to more than one languages, the issue of how to define a speech community becomes further difficult. So, for example, if we think about English language, the question is which dialect of English they learn and what does it depend upon? Does it depend upon the country or the city where they live? So, if you take the case of Pakistan, for example, who are the people who learn English more and who are the people who use it more and what kind of English do they learn, etc. And this also leads to another question: what is the target language that they want to learn? This varies again from place to place. So even if we take the case of, for example, Pakistan or of Africa or Australia, which one would be the target language or the second language for people? Even in the case of UK, where English is used mainly, this becomes a huge question. If I take the example of London, for example, this idea of target language becomes more like a moving target. Why? Because within the vicinity of, within the area of London, there are different languages that are being used. There are more than 300 languages that people use in London. So, for each group who uses a particular language, what would be the second language that they would like to learn or that they need to learn, and which one would be their target language is a difficult question to answer. So, in the sense of one speech community, when we think of London, it really becomes a confusing idea. With 300 languages spoken in this area, is it possible to consider it one speech community is a real tricky question. And why it is tricky? It is tricky because of two reasons. A, it is very big, very large area. B, it is fragmented. Different fragments of society speak different languages. So should we buy the idea of it being one large community or different communities divided into different parts, smaller communities based on geography, social class, occupation, gender, etc.? So, because all these elements of social class, ethnicity, gender, geography, etc., they have their role in shaping a speech community, we of course cannot put them separate and we cannot isolate the linguistic aspect to make it a single community. This leads to another idea, and that is of the idea whether a speech community is static or fluid. And again, this is very difficult to answer. Why it is difficult to answer? Because, for example, if we think that it is static, then we need to think, how does a speech community maintain being static? Is it possible for a speech community, for example, within London, this one speech community out of those 300 speech communities, the smaller communities, not to interact with any of the surrounding, communities and thus being in isolation? We know this is not possible practically. The other idea is that we agree that speech communities are fluid. Well, if we think of them as being fluid, what inferences must we draw concerning any concept we might have of speech community? Because, if they are fluid, they keep on overlapping, they keep on entangling, they keep on mixing with each other, they keep on separating, then again taking new shapes and new forms and again mixing, etc. Then, out of all that mess, how would we define one particular speech community as sociolinguistic, studies to be carried out? Another important question is are the boundaries of speech communities strong and clear, or they are weak or permeable? Again, taking the example of London, like all the big cities across the globe, the situation is not very homogeneous. Actually, there is a lot of heterogeneity. There is a lot of, variety within this one city. And I would like to quote Coupland 2007, who says, "Cities challenge the view that one discrete social style, that is one particular dialect, is associated with one place, which was the basic assumption in the analysis of rural dialects." If we look actually back at the history of how dialects were analyzed in sociolinguistics in the past. So mainly it is difficult to relate the concept of speech community directly to a language or the languages that are spoken, even by a particular group, because the norms and the values add to giving shape to a community. I hope you remember the example of Tucano, which is an official language of Northwest Arizona, and where the language of the husband and the wife is different and they come from different tribes, and where the wife has to speak the language of the husband when they have children. So, each of the residential communities there, they are multilingual in the sense that the marriages are intertribal from one tribe to the other. And, no language etiquettes in distribution to a specific residential community are found. There is a lot of mixing and, entangling of these communities. We find this kind of bilingualism in some other parts of the world, but of course this is not widespread. Bolinger states, individuals may belong to several speech communities which may be discrete or overlapping, just as they may participate in a variety of social settings. What he means by this is that one person can be a part of different speech communities depending upon his profession, his ethnicity, his area of residence, his gender, his interests, etc.